here?
Yep. All right. Thank you everyone for coming back after lunch. Now we have the next session, and our first speaker is Emily Burdett, who's going to be talking about developmental issues.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you both, John and Conrad, for inviting me. It's such a privilege to be here. So yes, I'm talking about developmental approaches to studying religion. Just before I start, some of you don't know me, so just wanted to say a little bit about my background. I'm originally from California, hence my accent, from Silicon Valley. I also have been at a variety of different places. My undergrad was in California, and then I did my DPhil at Oxford. And then I had a postdoc in St. Andrews, and then went back to Oxford to work with John, and then now I find myself at the University of Nottingham. And my work covers a variety of things. I do a lot of unreligious cognition, but I also do quite a bit in other realms as well. So just to give you some of that background. And I use a variety of methods as well within developmental psychology. So I use cross-cultural approaches, behavioral methods, and although not covered here, some evolutionary approaches, so some comparative work as well. So I'll be talking, so I think just to give kind of a layout of the talk, I'll be talking about several different types of methodology that we use in developmental work, especially to study religious cognition. I will just say I will touch on a lot of these, because a lot of these will be covered by specific talks over today and tomorrow. So I'll be talking mainly about certain specific issues in a developmental population using these types of methodologies and techniques. And within each of these, I'd like to just give some examples of how it's been used in religion. So I think there'll probably still be a lot of questions about particular methods, but I just wanted to give us somewhat of an overview of how these have been used with the developmental approach. So let's look at behavioral studies. So this is a paradigm that's been used in the last 15 years. It's called testimony paradigms. I should just say with behavioral studies, we're looking more at behavior, not necessarily at cognition or kind of sociocultural input. We're giving them some kind of paradigm, some kind of setup, some kind of vignette, and just measuring what their behavior is. So testimony paradigms are a type of one that we use. And this is also just kind of taking a step back. The rationale behind this is looking at social learning. So if you pair two different types of models and they each do a different way of doing things, we're also looking at kind of just the model. So you compare like expertise, you compare confidence, you compare competence as well, prestige, expertise, majority, whatever it is. And you can look to see who children choose to learn from. There's also another type of kind of this selective social learning where you can look at the content of behavior rather than the model. But here I'm going to be giving you an example of model-based biases. So this is an experiment that was done about 10 years ago with Sune Kim and Paul Harris. And they wanted just to see how children understand certain type of models, especially type of mind readers, so supernatural type of beings. So they didn't, I'll put here as a label, ordinary person versus mind reader. They didn't call these people this thing, but just so you can keep in mind as I'm talking about the experiment and their design, who these different models are. So they had a model that they characterized as an ordinary person, as well as one that was a mind reader. But they didn't tell children this. What they said was, here's Susan, so this person in the green top. She's thinking about a certain type of animal. And I'm going to show you two different people. I want you to choose who you think knows what animal she's thinking about. So this ordinary person says, I'll need some help. I think I'm going to ask Susan. And then Susan leans over and tells her what animal she's been thinking about. Said, okay, Susan is thinking about a giraffe. And then this other person says, I need some time. I'll think about it. Susan is thinking about a giraffe. And these are called familiarization trials. So they had about 3 to 4 of these familiarization trials where the child hopefully comes to realize one really needs a lot of help to understand what Susan is thinking, whereas the other one seems to have some special ability to think about what Susan is thinking about. So these were 3 to 4 and 5 to 6-year-olds, and this is important. younger children on the whole with testimony paradigms tend to struggle a little bit, partly because they're developing theory of mind. It's hard for them to take the perspective of others or also know the knowledge content of what another person is thinking. Whereas 5 to 6 years, we start to see some variation. Some of them tend to know and are able to perspective take. So in the test trials, they had 2 different types. One is a prediction test trials, so just about certain knowledge content. So this is another girl. So what is this little girl's favorite toy? So the ordinary person says it's a rubber duck. The other one says it's a bouncy ball. In the test cases, you ask the child, what do you think is this child's favorite toy? And they also had a label test trial. So what is this thing called? The ordinary person said it's a tog. This one's a FEP, and they asked the child, what do you think this toy or this object is called? And what they found was that the older kids, on the whole, were more likely to prefer whatever the item, the label, or whatever item that Susan was talking about. So they prefer the mind reader. The younger children were at chance. And largely, they think it's because when you ask them to differentiate, why would you think this, the mind-reading person would know? It seems like it's not just about the age. The younger kids are struggle. It's about those that are able to perspective take. So some of the younger kids who are able to think about or know that probably Susan wouldn't know because she's an ordinary person. There's some special ability that the mind reader had. If they're able to distinguish between the two, they tend to prefer the mind reader because they know that somehow she's got some kind of special ability. So they were able to identify, they were able to articulate that the mind reader had something special about her. Okay, so this paradigm, it's useful. It's because you can really test particular characteristics of a model, whether it be expertise, mind reading, the majority behavior, this kind of thing. It's a very simple setup, and you get results, especially with between probably around 4 to 6, you start to get that result. Younger kids really struggle. It's well used, it's easy and quick to administer, and children find it really easy just to select. So it's not a lot of verbal kind of participation on their point. They can easily select. They could even just point to whatever it is. So in some ways, their interaction is much easier. The problem, though, is because it's so easy and quick, it's somewhat simplistic. You can only potentially compare 2 types of model characteristics or content behavior. So sometimes it requires lots of conditions, also requiring a larger sample size. So those are some of the limitations with it. And obviously, like I was saying with the younger kids, cognitive maturation plays a role. So the younger kids struggle for a variety of reasons. It could be theory of mind, it could be inattention. There's lots of things. Younger kids across the board with developmental studies are harder to engage with. Okay, another type of behavioral task that we use a lot in developmental work, especially talking about supernatural belief, in particular ritual. We use a lot of imitation type of tasks. This is a classic one from Christine Laguerre's lab. And so in this paradigm, she's looking at how people understand kind of ritualized behavior, whether there's an end state or not an end state. So thinking about instrumental skills. So your left-hand panel, this is the ritual side. And then on the right side is an instrumental type of task. In the instrumental task, there is an end goal. So there's, in basically all the pictures, it's the same type of random use of objects except for the last bit. So in the instrumental, she takes an object and puts it inside a box and closes it. Whereas the other one, it basically goes back to the same setup in the beginning. So it's almost like a cyclical type of imitation. And kids are really sensitive to this. In cases where there's an instrumental goal, they tend to really focus on that endpoint and realize, oh, that was, I don't know about all the other stuff that they were doing and all of these other weird actions, but in the end, the goal was actually to put this object inside the box. Whereas in the conventional, there's a lot of almost meaningless actions. The idea, the rationale behind it is that it's some kind of ritual, so all of these things must be meaningful in some sense, so kids are much more good about copying each of these different actions that are in the conventional condition. So usually, the benefits of this is that it's usually nonverbal, so children find them easy to engage with. They're usually quick as well. If using video, it's a very highly controlled task, so you don't have to worry about non-consistency between experimenters. And then the limitations, though, it's just like with any behavioral task, we're making conclusions on mental behavior when obviously we're just measuring behavior. These also, in my experience, it takes a lot of piloting to get these right because you don't want to get ceiling behavior. So it's trying to figure out, because you don't want something salient too. Maybe there's really odd behavior in your imitation sequence that kids really zero in on. It could be too many types of actions or too little actions. So sometimes it can take quite a bit of piloting to get this right. We also see that there's less imitation with video. So videos are really helpful in the sense that they're consistent, but live models, we tend to get more imitative fidelity. But obviously that takes a lot of time, so it's really consuming. You have to make sure it's consistent. And arranging kind of those models there every single time with each child is practically impossible. But it has been done, but just so people are aware about that. So eye tracking, I'll talk about this one. I know that there's going to be another session on kind of neurological, physiological tests. I'm not sure if that will be in there, but just wanted to put this in because this has also been used in religious cognition as well. And this is a study that Jonathan and I were able to be a part of. And in this one, we had infants looking at several different types of conditions, basically looking at a counterintuitive agent. So these are little, it's hard to see on the screen probably, but just in brief, we have an agent that has to get across a valley for this experiment one. So one goes deep into the valley and over to the other side. The counterintuitive agent goes straight across, so they're flying across. And then what we wanted to see with this is kind of dominance. So do children predict that the counterintuitive agent probably has more power or more, what kind of attributes do they attribute to this counterintuitive agent? So in the test trial, there's a gift that drops down on the screen. And depending on the condition, either the intuitive agent grabs the gift and walks away, or the supernatural agent, or the counterintuitive agent grabs it. And so we measure kind of looking time. So this is a classic type of paradigm that's used with infancy. So depending on the type of condition, we habituate children to learn something about the event. And then in the test trials, we measure how long they look at something or how surprised they are, with the indication that when they look longer, they notice that something's different or unexpected or surprising for them. So this is the same kind of paradigm that we used here, is just to measure looking time for these infants. And we had several different types of conditions, looking at different types of counterintuitive events and controlling for certain types of other behavior. And we found that children do tend to be surprised if the intuitive agent takes it rather than the counterintuitive agent. So they expect someone with a lot of power to have more dominance and more supernatural kind of power in these kind of sense. So the benefits of eye tracking is it's nonverbal, so it's something that can be presumably used cross-culturally. And these paradigms are well established, and it's been used for decades. These kind of tasks that take a lot of creative thinking, working with infants, are really hard. They fall asleep, they become inattentive, they're cranky, they're hungry. Also because this is a behavioral task where we're inferring mental states, it requires a lot of creative thinking about how to do these designs quickly, and just to make sure what we're measuring is the construct that we're hoping for. It's very similar to scales and things. As most psychologists know, it's hard to know that what you're measuring is kind of that topic that you're hoping for. So same with the other behavioral tasks, we're making conclusions on mental states based on behavior. With these eye tracking experiments, it's really important to you that it's not just one experiment, you have lots of controls set up. So the challenge with these is that as you increase the conditions, you increase the sample sizes. It's really hard with infancy to recruit infants anyway, especially because if you're looking at a narrow window, cognitive maturation happens really fast in infancy. So oftentimes you're recruiting like 9 to 10-month-olds, which is a really narrow window. So data collection can take a long time until you get that sample that you need. And sample sizes are usually quite small in these types of populations, whereas with adults, we know that surveys, you can have thousands and thousands of participants. So the challenge with this is that you're inferring a lot with usually like a sample size of perhaps 20 to 30 infants, which is actually quite small. And of course, working with infants is really hard work. The other one that I want to talk about, I'm sure this is a very classic study, but I like this design because it's very creative, looking at how belief in the supernatural influences behavior. There's a lot of problems with this study in the form of small sample sizes, the way that they analyze the study, and the significance of it. But I want to use this as an illustration too, because I think it's I think it's a creative design. So for those of you that don't know this study, there were 3 conditions. So what they wanted was to measure whether kids cheat in a type of task. So they had a kind of like a dartboard in the back where it was made of Velcro. They had a ball that they would get a prize if they were able to throw this ball and hit kind of the bullseye. But the challenge is they had to do it without seeing the board, so they had to throw it behind them with their non-dominant hand. And so in the 3 conditions, the one condition was that the child was by themselves in a room. They had a certain amount of time to see if they could get that ball in the bullseye. The second one was the researcher stood in a room or sat in a room on this chair and watched the child engage with this activity. And then the third one is that they told them that Princess Alice was in the room. You can't see her, but she's sitting in this chair in the room, and she'll be there as you engage in the task. And basically the findings of this study is what they found is that those that either had the experimenter in the room or the Princess Alice condition, cheating behavior was decreased compared to the one when they were by themselves. When they were by themselves, they were more likely to cheat. And I do have a little video just so you can see what this looks like. There's no sound. So what I like about this is obviously the Princess Alice condition. And he tested his hypothesis out. He went and sat on the chair, and you can see she's not real. And then after he concluded that, he decided to go ahead and cheat and put the ball right into the center of the bullseye. And I didn't say this earlier, this is one of Jesse Baring's studies. So yeah, and like I said, there is some issues with this study anyway, but I think it's a really creative design. And I think just illustrates too the type of things that you can do in developmental psychology and watch with kids. And kids can suspend their belief. A lot of the kids did believe that she was in there, and their behavior was different. For this kid, he decided, nope, she's not real. I think I'm just going to go ahead and cheat. So just a lot of things that I've said before, just in conclusion with behavioral studies. I think children like these because they can participate. I find when I work with kids and do a lot of verbal type of tasks, if they're really shy, it's really painful to do it with the kids. But these types of studies are fun for the kids. And so I tend to like to do kind of these more participatory behavioral studies with them. They also make great videos for presentations as well. And I mean, that's just aside from the science, but I think that's engaging for everyone. And it takes a lot of creative thinking, but I think they can be really fun in that sense. And I think even better with behavioral studies, if they're bolstered with the other types of methodologies that I'll be talking about, we conclude a little bit more about the nature of supernatural belief. And the other limitations I've talked about before, so I won't reiterate those. Okay, the next one is observational and naturalistic methods. I think these are becoming more in vogue again in developmental psychology because I think with these, we can have a richer data set from which to code from videos. And there's lots of now excellent video software tools that we can use to code behavior. So this is something that's becoming more and more popular. So I'll just give some examples of things that people are using currently. One is open-ended storytelling. So this tends to be topical, so you can, for example, do parent-child dyads where you ask the parent or the child to talk about a particular topic, a particular holiday, could be a cultural or religious event. And then you use those videos or the audio to code for whatever level of analyses you're hoping for. So it could be the mention of a supernatural agent or event or whatever it is. And then potentially you can also use those stories to then do transmission studies. So based on that story, someone else listens to it and then they retell it, and you can see what types of elements, agents, events are then transmitted to the next person and that kind of thing. You can also look at memory, what kind of things are salient to that individual. So there's lots of things you can do with this type of methodology, just depends on what you're looking for. So it generates a potentially rich data set. It's also more natural. The problem is it's very open-ended, so you can't potentially control for certain things that you're looking for. It's really up to the person that's there, which also opens up to individual variation. Some people are much more chatty, much more detailed. So you might get in your participant data set some people that are really good at doing this, some not so much. It's time-consuming as well. Another one is parent-child conversations. This is becoming more and more popular as well in museum settings and religious settings. You're seeing a lot more of this as well. This is an example. I have the privilege of being part of what's called the Developing Belief Network, and it's a John Templeton-funded project that's looking at 30 different sites across the world and tracking the development of children over time. And I'll be talking about several methods that we're using in this project. So we're just doing the first wave of data collection now. And one of the tasks that we're using is parent-child conversations on a variety of topics. These are 4 questions. We have 6 questions, but these are 4 questions that we're using just to give you an example. So we have the parent and child sit in a room, and we tell them ahead of time that they're going to be talking about 6 different things, and we just leave it open-ended. We're just curious about how the parent and child talk about these things. So one of the questions is, how do trees grow? So we show them this picture about a little kind of sapling, and then there's a question mark and then a bigger tree, and we're kind of curious how they talk about how does that little tree get to the big tree. We also talk about what happens when we die, why do natural disasters happen, and how do we get better when we are seriously very sick. And the kind of level analysis that we're interested in, a lot of us are going to be kind of analyzing this from different angles. One of them could be mentioning of science versus mentioning of religious type of topics, kind of essentialism, is it a parent-led or child-led type of conversation, and then also how it differs cross-culturally as well. I mean, there's tons of things we can do with this data set, but these are some of the things that we're looking for. The other challenge with these kind of more open-ended ones is translation. So we get these and we go across to all different types of sites. We have to translate it back and then somehow compare them. So this is a challenge that we're currently dealing with as well. So a lot of these I've said before, it's time-consuming, it's not controlled. One thing I haven't mentioned though is it requires quite a bit of rigorous coding scheme. So as with any kind of psychological phenomenon, having some kind of way to code and define what it is you're looking for in the data set is really important. And also I think there's participant variation. Some will be more reflective, some will be much more insightful about some of the things, some will be very short. Again, that's still interesting, but it can make the level of analysis really difficult because it could be that the one thing you're looking for, they probably would know, but they just didn't mention in the conversation. And so you don't also want to ask follow-up questions because that's inconsistent to the different participants. So it can be really challenging to get the type of information that you want if you're not able to prompt and keep things consistent. And just also to say, like what I mentioned before, there's some great software now to help code data. So that's something that's really useful with this type of method. I think the challenge is also the coders. You have to do quite a bit of training to make sure that they can pinpoint getting the things out from the data that you need. So there's lots of, I think, wide variation. This kind of measure, I think, is best combined with other types of methodologies, so other surveys, demographic data, cognitive tests, surveys about their beliefs, because I think it gives a context to overlay what's being said in these conversations. And I guess the limit to that is that, of course, that takes a lot more time, a lot more resources to kind of gather this more holistic approach to this. Okay, the next one is survey data. So this is really tricky with kids as well. So I'll be talking about child and parent report measures, because I think with kids are not altogether reliable, I think, in their responses for a variety of reasons. It's also really uncomfortable for them. It's not, in my experience, sitting them with kind of more verbal text, they get really uncomfortable, and sometimes they'll just give you a response without any kind of reflection. And especially the young ones, I think sometimes they're just responding and they're not actually thinking about the response. So in the Developing Belief Network, we've developed a protocol, and it takes about an hour with these kids, which is impossible. So we're having to do it in chunks, either giving them 15 minutes a break, 15 minutes a break, or doing it over like 3 sessions, which isn't ideal, but we also want, in this first wave of data collection, to get a really good baseline of how children are responding to these different ideas. We're also asking 4 to 10-year-olds, so you can imagine the 4-year-olds, some of these questions, they'll have never heard of some of these things, like we're finding the Holy Spirit, so we're talking about Jesus, God, and Holy Spirit with a Christian group of kids. Some of the 4-year-olds have never heard of Holy Spirit. They've heard of God and Jesus, but not necessarily other things. We talk about a soul, some of them don't even know some of these concepts. So there's challenges with this as well. But that's part of the interesting thing, is where in development these kind of things are introduced and talked about and transmitted. So we've got a child protocol, but the important thing also is that we have a parent protocol to kind of bolster what children are thinking about and to get a different perspective. So this is just a glimpse of what we're also asking the parents. We give them scales, belief scales. We also ask them the same questions that we're asking the children, just to see if there's any kind of similarities in their conceptual development, but also to understand transmission. So if parents have a certain kind of anthropomorphic idea of certain things, do we see that also in their child, and does that seem to develop over time? So we're tracking these kids longitudinally over 3 years. And some other verbal Q&A tasks. So I love Deb Kelman's work. She does a lot of really cool studies. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with some of the work that she does, but this is just an example of a verbal type of tasks. And so she's looking to see how children think about the origin of things, where they come from. So she asks them questions like, where do you think rocks are so pointy? It's open-ended. Children can give a variety of responses. For example, one child said they're pointy, so that animals wouldn't sit on them and smash them. Instead of kind of the more scientific example, they're pointy because of its stuff piled up on top of one another for a long time. Why did the first bird ever exist? To make nice music, because it made the world look nice. So these are obviously kids that are reflective. They're being able to give some kind of response, which is good. So these are just some other examples. Why did the first river exist? So boats could come in the water so that people could do fishing. So these are all very teleological type of answers. And she also further asked, so we've been talking about these types of things. Now there's a question, did someone or something make the first ever mountain exist, or did it just happen? And based on these responses, she found that under half of the children said someone made the natural events, over half of someone said made the natural objects, and 73% said someone made animals. So she's getting, in this type of verbal paradigm, she actually is getting some consistent responses from kids, which is great. I'll just breeze over that one. So I think in conclusion with the verbal tasks, I think the benefits are is you can ask the direct question, you can get a direct response on a topic that you really want to hear the answer to. So it's very much on an explicit level. So it's not anything about behavior or implicitness. The problem is that some may say something, but in actual, for whatever reason, either for social desirability effects or because they think that's what needs to be said. You're not getting perhaps their actual beliefs, or perhaps in a certain situation that they might respond differently. So some other ways to counteract that is to do kind of another behavioral task, kind of test to see what their behavior would actually be. Other ways are looking at parent reports. So parents can also give a different context, either about the child's behavior, what they think, or even what they themselves are thinking, or how they talk about it in their family. The limitations with this, but younger kids tend to just give responses. We see with younger kids, sometimes we do get a consistent response, which is great. But at least in my experience, their answers sometimes aren't too reliable, either because of recency effects. They're just going to give you especially if you give like a dichotomous answer, sometimes they'll just go with no all the time, or I guess bias kind of tend to be predisposed to that as well. Also with shy kids, verbal tasks are unbearable for them, and so I find that unless you kind of really warmed them up, it's a real struggle for the shy ones. Also, verbal tasks are a huge pain if you're doing cross-cultural work because of all the translation that needs to happen. And not only just translating it, but making sure the kind of topic or term or whatever you're using really fits in that cross-cultural sample. So we're finding that a lot in DDN. There's a lot of variability in the types of topics that we're talking about, or the way that we're asking it, because we need to make it, even though we're asking it slightly different in different contexts, we think that by doing that, then we can get the same concept level. So there's a lot of challenges with this if you're trying to look at different groups, but I think the cultural piece is so important, because if we're going to be talking about universal development of religious cognition, we really need to be able to compare across samples. So there's some kind of methodological decisions that have to take place in order to be able to ask the same questions to different samples. Okay, and one of the kind of classic, I think with CSR and talking about child development and conceptual development, one of the first tasks that really kind of looked at supernatural agency is kind of adapting theory of mind tasks to look at how children conceptualize supernatural agents. So this is now a seminal study. So Justin Barrett adapted a theory of mind task, a false belief task, to ask children about human agents, animal agents, and then God, just to see how children reason about this. The task goes, you give them some kind of familiar box, you ask them what's inside. Clever kids say, of course, there's crackers inside, and then you show them something surprising inside the box, and then you ask about other agents, so who haven't revealed what was inside the box, what they think is inside. So kids tend to not pass. For example, if they say, okay, if mom walked in, what do you think she would think is inside the box? They don't pass if they say, oh yeah, mom knows there's rocks inside the box. And they do pass if they think, oh yeah, mom's going to be fooled, and she's going to also think that there was crackers inside the box. So Justin Barrett did this task and asked about a variety of agents there. The yellow line is God, and he concluded that because children, even from this younger age, tended to know that God would know what was inside the box, that they'd have this kind of prepared reasoning about supernatural agents. And I'm highlighting this also as well, it's a seminal study, but I think since we're talking about methodology, that since then there's been tons of replications of this, and with slight tweaks to methodology, and then kids have very different answers. So I don't have the slide in here, but Jonathan Lane then took the study and then looked kind of a fine-grained analysis what was happening between 3 and 4, and found that actually children are still quite anthropomorphic. They don't seem to have this prepared tendency, but they're quite still anthropomorphic. And then I've taken this study to the Dominican Republic, Israel, Kenya, and the United Kingdom, and asked about kind of an agent that would kind of be classified as this omniscient type of supernatural agent, but then also some other kind of supernatural agents that are a little bit more limited. So like an angel in the Dominican Republic, the sun or ancestor spirits in Kenya, and then in Israel and the United Kingdom we meet up kind of more limited supernatural agent named Swek. And you can see that there's quite a bit of variation across culture. Part of it is theory of mind tends to develop slightly differently in other contexts. probably because of education, a variety of other sociocultural reasons. But interestingly also, I think these more limited minds, so they may have supernatural powers, but perhaps not the more omniscient type of characteristic that we attribute to God. The limited kind of sense of these agents is a little bit more tricky for children to respond to, whether they would think that agent would know or not know, or actually cares at all about these types of tasks as well. Rebecca Ricker is looking a lot about kind of conceptual development of supernatural agents. And I really like what she's doing now because she's taking different types of religious traditions, different types of cultures, kind of more in a microcosm to see what's going on. And a study that she did a few years ago was looking at kids who are Protestant Catholic, what she calls non-affiliated children, and also Muslim children. And what she's finding and she's asking parents as well, she's finding that the transmission from parents seems to be the characteristic most important to whether children have kind of a more anthropomorphic understanding of God versus not. So this transmission piece is really important. That sociocultural input is really important. So stay tuned for those types of analyses as well. So the benefits of using the cognitive tests, they're very well established in other types of domains. So using them to look at religious cognition is also, I think, an important piece that you can use them. They're relatively quick tests, depending on what tests you use. And like with most of these methodologies, I think it's really good to bolster with other types of methodologies. I think it's really important with the cognitive test to have some kind of cross-cultural component as well. I think a lot of the assumptions that are made with cognitive tests is that these are universal, but hopefully with that slide looking at the cross-cultural piece, they're not universal. The way that development, kind of maturation, there's huge variation across populations. So it's something to keep in mind when you use these, that it may not be the same kind of developmental track that one population has compared to another. So yeah, and I think another thing to really think about with these is sometimes it's hard to know when you're seeing variation, whether it's a component of cognitive maturation. It could be partly methodology, so especially like with theory of mind tests, the way you ask it, kind of the type of theory of mind task you use, all these things can really make a huge difference in the kind of the results that you're using. So just to be really careful on kind of your conclusions with these is what's really going on. Is it sociocultural? Is it cognitive maturation? Is it your research design? And one last thing with this, that these cognitive tests are useful, but I find with delivering them to kids, they're very repetitive. So if you're asking about a lot of agents, you can see the kids start to glaze over at a certain point. Like if you ask them about 7 agents, they're like, yes, yes, yes. Like they're not even paying attention at some point. So sometimes it's hard to, counterbalancing helps because then you can understand, which agents they're talking about. But at some point you also need to be very good with interviewing with the kids or kind of limit to the point of what you're actually, how many agents you have in this kind of task. The other thing that I think is important is to look at kids longitudinally, cross-sectionally, so comparing their age groups if you're able to track it over time, and cross-cultural designs. I think what developmental psychology is moving towards are these types of methods, because I think at some point we need to know how these things develop, and also if it's a universal idea. So that's something that's currently trying to be tackled with this network called the Developing Belief Network. And we're focusing on 5 different themes. So folk theories, ontological boundaries, causal explanatory reasoning, and then transmission. So we've got 3 different topics here. So through verbal information, through written sources, and through nonverbal behaviors, things like ritual. So please stay tuned for a lot of the conclusions that we're making. We're almost finished with wave 1, the data collection, and we've got 2 to 3 more time points that we'll be looking at here. So I think longitudinal and cross-sectional designs are essential. I think in order to make any type of conclusion about kind of religious cognition, it's really important to know how it's developed, how it's been transmitted, I think development is a really crucial part in our kind of cognition to understand where these ideas are coming from. The unfortunate thing is it's expensive, it's time consuming, it requires a lot of staff, a lot of manpower, especially if you're looking at longitudinal, there's a lot of attrition, so families, kids won't stay with you kind of for the 3 years, so it's being able to motivate them to stay in touch with you, but I think these types of processes, it's really important for developmental work and for the conclusions we'd like to make about religious cognition. And that's all I have. I mean, it's kind of a whistle-stop tour. I'm sure there's lots of questions, but I hope some of the other talks that are going to be going on, actually we'll touch on kind of like the nitty-gritty of some of these types of methodologies, but at least hopefully you've gotten a glimpse of kind of the developmental aspect of it. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, actually, if I can start off, right, I'm being a bit naughty by wanting to be the first person asking question. The kind of worry that John talked about in his first talk, right, about whether we have beliefs, what the beliefs are and so on, seems to me to be particularly problematic when we're looking at kids, right, because certain categories that work well with adult minds simply just fall apart at some point when you go back in developmental history. So could you talk to that? To what degree and at what stage can we talk about kids having something that could be called supernatural beliefs?
That's a great question. Which it's hard because, I mean, kids, their belief systems are so tied up into their family. As well, and so oftentimes you will find their belief really tied up to what their family is kind of transmitting to them, and so their own beliefs, we think, don't tend to develop until kind of later childhood or adolescence when they start to kind of have more of an identity of their own thinking. And beliefs are hard. I think a lot of the work that's been done is these behavioral tasks.
Yeah.
So looking at, given a situation, a certain context, how do they behave? And from that, we kind of infer what their beliefs are.
Mm-hmm. So they make certain distinctions that you can, for example, see in how long they look at particular video presentation.
Yeah, when they look at something, or like in the Princess Alice, what they actually do. If they truly believe that Princess Alice was there, does that decrease of their cheating behavior or whatever? But as far as like verbally too, I think a lot of them don't really know on a complex kind of what they do believe, and a lot of them, their responses will probably align very closely with what their parents believe, or at least their kind of community. So it's quite tricky, and I think even definitional, if you ask them kind of what belief is or what they believe in, I think it's going to be a slippery kind of thing. So it's a huge challenge, I think.
It's always seemed to me, I mean, it's always seemed to me that developmental psychologists are quite like critically thoughtful about what the tasks mean and what they're meant, right? I mean, like think of like the endless debates about what the false belief task is actually measuring, right? And like people have gone back and forth on this for decades, and in some ways, we have this kind of prevailing belief that, as Conrad just expressed, we kind of know what's happening in adult minds, but like children's minds are a black box. In some ways, that's kind of the problem, that we have these assumptions. Like, why are we assuming that we know what's going on in adult minds? Like, I think the thing I'm proposing about scales is to be more like developmental psychologists, to interrogate more what the hell our tasks are doing.
I didn't mean to say that we know what's going on in adult minds. I was just saying that this is even worse.
Yeah, well, indeed, but it's worse in one sense. But I think as a discipline, I mean, how many of you have ever tried to submit a paper to the developmental psychology journal? It's a fucking pain in the ass. It's so critical, right? But in some ways, why shouldn't the rest of us be as critical as developmental psychologists about what our tasks are doing, or what they're measuring? Like, I think there's something exemplary about developmental psychology.
Like you could go halfway between there, and it would still be effective.
Yeah. I think they're unnecessarily mean in some ways, right? But still. Yeah.
All right, next question. All right, Robin.
May I? Great. Fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it much. I have a very similar question, but I paid attention, and have you ever used the Likert scale with children or some closed-end question, and where? Was it in the presentation, or I just missed it?
So I have used Likert. So you can do these really fun ones where you can, like, if you agree, you do more. Okay, if you really agree, do this. So what we're doing in the developmental belief things, okay, if you kind of agree, just do this. If you really agree, do this. If you kind of aren't sure, do one of this. If you're kind of unsure, do here. If you're really unsure, so they get kind of, and we do these practice kind of 4 or 5 questions, like, oh, how much do you like broccoli? A lot of them are like, ugh. How much do you like ice cream? So they get used to kind of doing this. And then kind of a middle one, like, how do you feel about, something that's middling, can't think off the top of my head, how do you feel about paper? It's kind of like, oh, so they get practice of using what a Likert scale might be.
Yep.
And kids seem to get to this. Younger kids, they're usually like this all the time. Whereas I think the older kids are a little bit more nuanced. But you can get them to use it.
We actually did work with children. We interviewed over the years over, I think, thousands of them, and we adopted a measure from anthropologists, let's say on Papua New Guinea. People are not much used to the written language. However, they can compare sides of fruit. So we combined different sizes of circles. And most of the children, at least in Czechia, they are quite used to the evaluation in school. In Czechia, we have from 1 to 5. So we put the evaluation from the school and work that way. So we modify all the questions just to fit on the Likert scale with different sizes of circles plus the numbers.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering that I didn't saw it in the presentation, and just small question. I will definitely catch you after the talks. But you work with 3-year-old children, and I have like no idea how to converse with 3-year-old about the 4-year-old. Half of them, if they are socialized, it's like talking with an adult, more or less. But 3-year-old, how on earth?
I should point out, Robin doesn't have kids.
Yeah, 3-year-olds are hard. Tons of times I've asked them, serious questions. So they're like, you want to know what I have for breakfast? They go off on this tangent, and you have to bring them back to, it's really hard. And they're squirrely. They're kind of doing other things. So you kind of almost have to be a wrangler, magician, entertainer, almost to work with.
So and the time schedule, I found that 20 questions is top. Like the attention span that you can do with children, randomly on some public event, not more than 20 questions. Even 15 is closing to top. So you get your participants for a whole day, and then you get 5 minutes. Children goes to play, and after that 5 minutes. That's how you do it?
So just for this protocol, it depends on kind of what the family prefer. So we tell them that this protocol takes an hour. Would you prefer to split it up over, 2 hours to do different activities, or can we call you, can we set up, 3 different sessions? Because we also find that 15 minutes seems to be the perfect time period for the younger ones. And you don't want them to get tired. You want them to treat each kind of section as fresh as they can be. So yeah, we tend to do different breaks, or ideally we do it in different sessions with the families, allowing us to kind of interact with them.
Sure. So that way you get only children from parents that are highly interested in participating, studying religion, science, and highly investing in their children, and be willing to spend time to go to your lab and back. So it's like specific fraction of, yeah. Actually, there is an opposite way how to do it. Plus, it takes less time to. You can go to the public event where there are parents with children, and usually parents are quite okay to lend you a children for 5 minutes because they can go for coffee. It's like free babysitting, and then you can do it. We actually find it that it's much more effective that in one day you can have 70 participants. with parents present than doing it the reverse. But of course, in laboratory you have everything more or less in control.
Yeah, but some of the work that we're doing here, that's how we get them. So at these kind of scientific events, the families are there, and we do kind of the first part of some of these protocols. So the parent-child conversations are actually happening at these science events, and they're a wide variety of traditions. And so we invite them if you're interested. We've got kind of 2 other components if you'd like to participate, but at least we've got kind of one sample of this. And then a lot of them actually, about 75% say, yeah, I'm willing to do this again, because they've gotten to know us, they've had a good time.
That's amazing.
And they're willing to kind of see the rest of the...
And you're paying them for the visit?
Yeah, we're paying them.
But presumably the parents don't leave the kids with you and then go away for coffee, right? I mean, that seems highly illegal in the UK. I don't think that's a thing that...
One of the science ones that we do, it's basically run over a whole morning.
I see, right.
And so the parents are there. We have a cafe set up for them. So they're within visible distance, but they can go and have a coffee and enjoy themselves while they watch their kids run around and do different stuff.
That's the upside of a high-trust society.
Okay. Yeah, Russell.
Thanks for that talk, it was wonderful. I was just looking on the web at the Developing Belief Network, which looks great. I love the sort of serious commitment to doing the cross-cultural work, which I think is really essential in psychology these days. But I'm curious about how the sites were selected, whether there was some sort of targeted sampling strategy to like maybe sample across different religious beliefs and practices, or whether it was just who could be got. Because I notice most of the sites are in the north, and there's nothing from the Pacific, which is interesting for me coming from the Pacific, because in lots of Polynesian societies there's a lot less kind of overt mentalizing type talk, and there's some suggestions of like much less kind of theory of mind type development. And yes, I'm just curious about the history, because I think, you know, the sad thing these days is everyone says we have to move beyond studying just weird people, and, you know, diversity is key, but then how you sample diversity, I think, is sort of often under-theorized.
Yeah, so I mean, there was a call for people to put in their sites, and so I think, I'm not sure how many there ended up being. I wasn't on the board, so I was an application myself. But from what they told us, how they selected each of our sites was based on kind of traditions that were available, also how established the sites were. So I have a site in the UK, but I've also got Michael Gervin. So his site as well in Bolivia, which is well established. So I think that's one of the reasons why we were chosen. But also within that site, there's some rich religious traditions as well. And the other sites too, I think they were trying to get an overall kind of spread of religious traditions and areas, but also well-established sites. So it really was also to the point of who was applying as well. So I think a lot of them were denied because it just wasn't an established site for the people that were there. There was supposed to be another call in the next year for additional 10 sites, so I think we're hoping to fill in some of the gaps that we don't have. So like that part of the world, as well as kind of some parts of Asia that are missing. So we're hoping that still happens, but this is kind of what we wanted, was just an initial baseline, this wave one data collection with some established sites, and then hopefully we're going to open it up to other things, because I think that's super important that we get a well-rounded sense of what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you for a great talk. Just a very quick question about feasibility, because these cross-cultural studies are obviously the way to go, but they are super expensive and you have to have a large grant, blah, blah, blah. So my worry is about statistical power, which is usually the worry with these vulnerable populations, hard to get populations, and you mentioned it yourself. So I have a pragmatic question. Recently there was a paper, I forgot who was the first author, but anyway, it was a paper in Psych Science on how children punish in-groups or out-groups based on their parents' political beliefs. And they had the first wave of testing was actually in a museum where they just, you know, caught parents and tested their kids. And the second wave during COVID was actually done online. I don't know if do you know the study? Have you read about it? Okay, great. So my question is, like, what's your opinion about these online type of studies? Because from my understanding, they just sent people a link so that, you know, they could choose themselves when to take part in the study, and they recorded themselves and their kids taking part in the study. So, you know, they kind of have pretty good experimental control over that. So it really caught my attention that, you know, this may be a way to go to increase the sample size quite, let's say, cheaply, you know, with some obvious limitations. But I mean, anyways, that's my question. Like, what's your opinion about this methodology? Thank you.
So it's a great question too, because the developing network, it started in 2020, and so the question we were quickly faced with is, how are we going to do this with the pandemic going on, and with different sites completely, you know, different types of regulations, restrictions with the pandemic. And so what we decided at that point was that some sites will be in person, some sites will be online, but we need to be consistent, at least for that site, how they're going to be approaching. So that's kind of how we dealt with it with this developing Leaf network. And some are choosing to stay online just in case things get worse. I know that, I mean, as an experiment, so I have 2 kids myself, and just to kind of understand how online kind of science works, I've had my kids participate in a lot of kind of online studies. A lot of them actually are replications that they were participating in, so they've had a paradigm that they've done in person, and now because of the pandemic, they're seeing, actually, they're getting similar results when they do it online with families. And a lot of the studies, at least initially, it seems like a lot of them are pretty comparable. But I think it depends on the level of how you're doing it. So I've seen some where they just send you a link and you have to record the session of you and your child. So there's no experiment or interaction. It's just kind of more of a naturalistic setup. There's others where it's a live Zoom call. So it just simulates kind of like you're in person like you would do, so that researcher's in front of you and you're kind of doing it live. And there's other ones, you know, where, you know, it's kind of paper and like there's nothing live about it. There's no, you know, I think it's kind of, you do the task and then you send whatever it is. So I think the ones where it's live, where there's some kind of accountability, I think those are better in kind of replicating the in-person results. It's risky when you just let them go off and do it yourself, because you have no way of, like, what was the control set up, and you kind of are at the mercy of whatever these people are doing to kind of fill these things out. So I think a lot of the people, as long as these control setups are in place, it looks like the results are pretty comparable. And I think actually a lot of people have now adapted to more online, because it tends to be more convenient for the participants and the families. Potentially also for labs, you also get more of a wider range of accessing participants, so it doesn't necessarily have to be local. It could be countrywide or, you know, cross-culturally wide. Also solves some of the problems with how expensive things are to travel, because you can do it online. So I think there's lots of benefits now from doing it. I think people have to be so much more careful and controlled, and because you're kind of going into people's homes with this, there's also an ethical consideration of when you're faced with this, you know, in case you observe something that's happening, there's also, I think you've got a duty to think about those things as well. So I think there's lots of promise in it. I think in some ways it's still a little bit too early to tell, but it seems like it can be a promising way to think about wider sample sizes and bigger sample sizes and the resource issue.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question, actually. There was this famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, study by David Buss on human mate preferences, and this, you know, a huge parent cross-cultural study, 37 different societies around the world. But if you look into it, the vast majority of people that were surveyed in that study were psychology undergraduates. So although there were lots of different cultures, so-called, represented, actually it was a very thin and selective sample that was got, because it's not really representative of the full populations they came from. So I wonder, in this study, whether you're gathering metadata, because I think, you know, if you say you need a computer to respond, that cuts out lots of families, even in relatively wealthy countries such as New Zealand. So there are all these cultures. what does the metadata say about how representative of those populations the samples are?
That's a great question. So at least, I mean, what we're doing in the DDN, so unfortunately, the online studies are basically in the weird societies, the ones that have access to this. There's not that option in some of the African societies or kind of some of the other Indonesian societies. So the people, it's just not an option. It has to be in person. So then again, we're faced with how do you compare then these different sample sizes. So I think, but on the whole, the decision was made was because of the pandemic. So it's either some populations then can't, will have to delay their data collection for years until the pandemic is at a point where they can go in person, or we just, because of this is the situation we're in, we're going to have to just do it this way. So I think it was more of a practical decision because of the pandemic and not because of any other decision. That was just the way that we had to do things because we only, go ahead.
Have you got metadata on, like, say, the social and economic background of the families and that kind of thing?
So there's
educational backgrounds, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so we have an extensive kind of demographic section for the parents to fill out about not only their socioeconomics, but their perception of it and kind of what their education background is and all that kind of thing. So each place will have that as well. Yeah. Yeah, so we also have a point too where we want to make it more ethnographic, so get a real kind of the contextual part of where these families and communities are coming from.
All right, well, as usual, we've gone a little bit over time, but that's all fine. I think we better finish up here. Now, while we are getting set up with Ayana speaking, I wanted to get Robin to tell us something about the options we have for dinner, or perhaps Helena.